Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to some of you as well. Thank you for tuning in with us here at Alta Planning and Design for an installment of the Alta Innovation Lab webinar series. We're very excited this morning. This is Tim Gustafson in the Chicago office for Alta Planning and Design, and I'm excited to lead you through a discussion today with two individuals we have here that we're talking with. There's been a lot of activity since we've begun the year with the release of the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide. And this is another in a series of offerings that we're continuing to roll out to help people in communities around the country to innovate in best practices for design and planning for multimodal facilities. Today we're calling it the Case Studies and Lessons Learned because we're very excited to have people from all over the country, on both coasts as a matter of fact, joining us to talk about their experiences. So we've got quite a big day planned, and I'm very excited to see that we have all time zones represented in our panels and in some of our support staff around the country. I've got two gentlemen who are joining us from opposite sides of the country. So like I mentioned, we've got someone on each coast. The first is Stephen Steese, who's the city administrator from the city of Easley, South Carolina. Stephen, good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining
good afternoon and good morning to everybody.
Excellent. On the other side of the country, we have Mr. Adobe Class, who's the Director of Public Works from the city of Arcata, California. Adobe, good morning. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning as well.
All right, gentlemen, thank you for joining us, and I'm very much looking forward to showing everybody some of the experiences that you have. And for those of you just joining us, the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide was released in the end of last year, December 2016, by the Federal Highway Administration. It was funded in part by FHWA and Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota. And we here at Alta Planning and Design were fortunate enough to work on this project. And part of our project team included Montana State University's Western Transportation Institute and the National Association of Counties. So it's a very exciting project to be a part of. We're very excited that this continues to produce additional support and guidance. And this webinar series is a continuation of that because in part of the development of the guide, there was an effort to reach out to various communities across the country and learn from them about their experiences in implementing multimodal facilities. And those, in fact, made their way into the guide, which is why we have these two gentlemen joining us this morning. In addition to our panelists, we've got a couple of people here with Alta Planning and Design who will be supporting today's discussion. Joe Gilpin in our Bozeman, Montana office was the principal in charge for the project. So if later on this morning we have any questions that are related to the production of the guide, working with FHWA and the assembly of the project over the course of it, feel free to type in those questions at the bottom of your chat panel. We also have Sydney Leonard in our North Carolina office, and she will be actually fielding those questions. So thank you both for joining, and good morning and good afternoon to both of you. As we continue on, I wanted to give people who may not be familiar with the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide just a brief overview of what's in the guide and a little bit of the history and context, and then we'll talk a little bit about the content before we turn it over to Stephen and Adobe. So the guide is structured in the following manner: the purpose of why it's here, and also giving you a sense of what's inside, as well as where the sources of information came from, how it's applied, what benefits might be in there, and then as I've been mentioning, the project examples and those case studies, which I think are very valuable. So feel free to visit it online. The guide is available on the FHWA website. We also have the ruraldesignguide.com website in case you're interested in that. And then, of course, if you have any questions related to any of that content, you can learn about it on the altaplanning.com website as well. So let's get into a little bit of the history and the context of the guide. First of all, we know that this guide does not stand alone and that it's part of a long line and a continuing conversation for various design guidance across the country, many of which come from the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. You can see the publications here on your screen. There's also a lot of great guidance coming from the Federal Highway Administration, including the guide that we're talking about this morning and this afternoon, and additional guidance from the Public Rights-of-Way Access Guidelines and Bike Safe. To give you a little bit of context of where this discussion has come from is back in 2010, the Federal Highway Administration released a policy statement stating that walking and bicycling foster safer, more livable, family-friendly communities, promote physical activity and health, and that's just the point at which they encouraged agencies and transportation departments across the country to go beyond the minimum requirements that may exist in just the AASHTO Green Book, for example, or the MUTCD, and to actively encourage people that they recognize that they're seeking innovation to accommodate users of all ages and abilities in the transportation networks. From that sprang forth quite a bit of design guidance. Many of these really good guidance from the Institute of Transportation Engineers. You see here on the left side of your screen is Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares, a Context-Sensitive Approach. The National Association of City Transportation Officials has released a series of guidance in the Urban Street Design Guide, the Urban Bikeway Design Guide. Many of these followed after some of the initial guidance based on the encouragement of the FHWA and the innovations that were happening around the country. In 2013, the FHWA doubled down and stated that they encourage taking a flexible approach to bicycle and pedestrian facility design. And this is the point where they specifically identified these best practices from these other agencies and these other publications and really encourage people to look into these and seek these out and dig deeper to get best practices. And that's the point at which we started working with communities all across the country. And many of them were saying, we understand that this design guidance is out there and we really do like it. One of the things that we're starting to notice is that some people were stating that this doesn't necessarily reflect my existing conditions, or this doesn't look like my community. And so enter the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide to address the fact that indeed one size does not fit all. We recognize that rural needs and smaller towns have certain needs that are unique, in that there are certain things about small towns and rural communities that need to be addressed when thinking about networks that are multimodal. The first is that their trips are longer in rural and smaller towns. Rural trip distances have been growing, meaning that walking and bicycling trips in some of these areas are actually longer than could be made in an urban area. Add to that, there are health disparities between smaller towns and urbanized areas, that those living in rural areas have higher rates of physical inactivity and chronic disease than those living in urbanized areas. To help support that as an interest in improving multimodal networks. We also have been learning that the crash rates in rural areas are higher. While only 19% of the population of this country may live in a rural area, this is where 58% of fatal crashes and 60% of traffic fatalities occur. Add to that, there's also an income disparity, so an interest in diversifying your transportation networks to maintain economic independence and the reduced reliance on automotive travel for sole transportation. We know that in urban areas, household incomes are approximately 32% higher than those in rural. So there's an increased need in affording people the opportunity to travel by other means. This also presents a unique opportunity in that smaller towns and rural areas are smaller geographically, and that the ability to travel across them may be more feasible if investments in transportation are made to increase multimodal transportation. So what does the guide have in it? So let's take a look at the guide content. The guide provides lots of very good guidance, and there are 3 areas of content in specific design guidance that you'll see here that are in bold. These include mixed transportation facilities, visual separation, and physical separation. And we'll get to a screenshot that shows kind of what an example of those might look like. And then the layout of the guide, very highly graphical, and is intended to show the application of a particular design treatment. We see here the shared roadway 2-page spread showing you what it looks like, lots of leader lines talking about its elements, and then guidance over on the right-hand side that show you different ways in which it could be applied based on roadway posted speed, roadway average daily traffic volume, what types of roadways in your network might be good candidates, and what the land use context might be for this situation. There's also guidance on the geometric design, your use of pavement markings, signs, what to do at intersections, how to go about implementing a project of this nature, when's an appropriate time to do so, and then considerations for pedestrians with accessibility requirements. Not to be left out of that discussion there on the lower left is an example of a case study. Those are peppered throughout the guide for various design treatments, and that's the point at which we decided to take the conversation to these individuals who have joined us today to talk about some of their experiences. So as I mentioned, this is the typical applications that you might see in the guide, lots of photographic evidence for various communities who have implemented it around the country. And we were very fortunate to have 2 of them join us this morning to talk about their case studies. And so with that, we're going to get into 2 of the particular case studies, which actually are contained within the guide. We have the screens, the pages up here on your screen showing what that case study looks like from the city of Arcata, California, and a case study from the cities of Pickens and Easley, South Carolina, just like the gentlemen who introduced themselves this morning. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and get started first with Stephen Steese of Easley, South Carolina, who's going to give us a little bit of an overview on the Doodle Trail. So Stephen, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And I'll try not to take too much time and just do a good brief overview here. The Doodle Trail is a rails to trail project that we opened Memorial Day 2015. It is a joint venture between the city of Easley and the city of Pickens, South Carolina. Just to give you a little bit of idea, city of Easley, we're a little over 20,000 population. City of Pickens is a little over 3,100 population, separated by about, I guess you'd say as the crow flies, about 5 miles, but along the Doodle Trail, it's about a 7.5 mile journey along the old railroad bed. So the communities came together back about 2012, and there was interest in buying the railroad bed and turning it into a rails to trail project. This was done, and the rail line had been dead for a few decades. It was originally a commuter line that ran back and forth between Pickens and Easley to handle mill traffic and to bring goods and people to the two communities and allow for them to access larger railroad lines that came through the city of Easley, most notably the Norfolk Southern line. So it was turned into a 7.5 mile, 10-foot wide, multi-use trail that runs between the two communities. About 95% of the trail is actually in the unincorporated county of Pickens County. Since it was open, the city of Easley, we have completed a 1.1 mile extension from there into our downtown area that is part dedicated multi-use trail and part taking a road and doing shared use, where we have actually made it one direction and use the other side of the road as the trail bed. And that was opened in April 1st of this year. The city of Pickens is actually in the process of tearing down the old train depot, doing some remediation on the site, and extending their trail about 1/4 mile to touch their downtown. Both sides are in the process of constructing trailhead parks. Ours has just got notice to proceed, and it will have an exercise loop, improved parking, playgrounds, community center, community shelter, and restroom facilities on our end. And the one that's going in the city of Pickens will be similar in that it will have the restrooms and community facilities, and I think they're putting a park at the end of theirs as well. So since we went in together on this project, we have joint jurisdiction on the original 7.5 miles that was bought. We actually have a committee that's made up, it's a 10-member committee made up of council members and community members that are appointed, and they oversee the original 7.5 mile trail to make sure that any projects, any work, any issues that arise are handled and are done so uniformly along the trail. We also at the staff level communicate very frequently and handle requests for people who want to use the trail for 5Ks or events and stuff like that. And also anything that may occur, like if there's a section of fence down or anything like that, we will communicate and make sure that gets reported to the correct city. We have an agreement worked out where we maintain and cut the grass and kind of do the work on the bottom half of the trail, and Pickens does the same thing on the northern half of the trail, unless it's a major issue that would require large amounts of money that we may need to go in together on. Again, with the jurisdiction, about 95% of the original trail was in the county. The county chose not to participate with this project, but we did have to bring them in when it came to policing and enforcing illegal use of the trail, and the sheriff's office was willing to do that. And that was one of the things we needed to make sure we communicated to the people along the trail, was who to contact should there be an issue with something along the trail, especially criminal-wise. One of the questions they kind of proposed to us was this an opportunity or was this really a plan? And for us, I would say everything in the initial phase was really an opportunity. We were working on a greenway project. Pickens was working on a off-road biking park, and the community kind of came and said, those are great, but what about those that just want to ride our bikes on the road? We really don't have a safe place to do it. What about the railroad? We reached out to them in 2012, and then within 3 years we had purchased, designed, done design build, and opened the park, which was a pretty quick turnaround compared to some of our neighbors. So it really was an opportunity that worked out great for us. Now, what's been done to the park since, to the trail since then, really has been more in planning and trying to figure out long term on how to connect the trail, not just between the two cities, but within the cities to different neighborhoods and different areas, as well as trying to see if there's anything we can do regionally with our parks. So outside from that, I think that's an overview. You can see some of the pictures in the slide. You will notice on the bottom, you'll see some of the shared use roads. And if you look up at the top, you'll see the 10-foot multi-use trail that is dedicated strictly for biking, walking, those purposes, no electronic vehicles, and the fencing and the rural setting of the trail that actually spends about 7 miles winding through the countryside and about a half a mile in more dense settings around the city cores. So thank you,
Stephen. Yeah, thank you very much for giving us a really great overview and kind of talking about the process. I was particularly interested in noticing when you mentioned that it was a joint venture between those two cities, and that it even was able to succeed without the involvement of the county until such time as it came to talk about things related to enforcement after the trail was open. So that's actually not unique across the country. I think we've heard some people that have similar experiences, so I'm very thankful that you were able to kind of talk through your experience and how that worked, particularly with the appointment of that 10-person committee, and that this also involves that improved coordination between the two cities through that unincorporated area, and also sharing jurisdiction on maintenance and scheduling events. So that was a very great intro. And for those of you listening in, we're going to give an intro for each of these, and then I've got a few questions that we're going to kind of ask both of them. And so this is a really great starting off point, Stephen, and thank you for your participation in kind of sharing your project experience.
Thank you.
And next we have Adobe Class from the city of Arcata, California. This was another case study that was featured in the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide. And this is a unique project in the city of Arcata, and Adobe Class, thank you for joining us. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your project.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. We really started this project concept-wise in early 2000s, 2007, 2008. It was one of the suite of projects we included in our pedestrian master plan. At that time, we had to have our own specific plan in order to get funding through what was at that time known as the bicycle transportation account. It really was geared towards creating a bike centric type city, towards creating the ability for bicyclists to feel safe and have a special kind of place to be able to go without the elimination of the motor vehicle. So we typically have a street grid layout, a Roman grid layout, classic 300 by 300 foot square grid layout in our city. We have a very active and helpful committee. The Transportation Safety Committee has been around for almost 30 years now in the city of Arcata, and they were very proactive in the bicycling community looking at this. So I took a trip down to the Bay Area and saw a version of this down in Berkeley, and we came up with our own concept of this. So I think I indicated we have 50-foot right-of-ways here and typically 40-foot pavement sections. So we looked at where cyclists, through our update of our bike plan, where did cyclists feel they needed some additional connectivity? Where did they where did we not have a way of connecting through town? And these two roads in town, basically 2 half-mile sections, what was I Street, and which was a north-south road that basically led between a high school area, and then an east-west connection, which was on 10th Street, which basically led between our intermodal transit facility, where a lot of people go through there. We're the only transit hub in the county, and then extends out to the west. The viability of transportation alternatives is really a goal of our general plan. So that's really what drove it. The concept obviously is to create these bike preferred routes And in our process, really, those of you that are familiar with the bike boulevard, it's signage. We did we did a specialty bicycle spoke kind of hub crossing where the two boulevards cross. We did a lot of wayfinding signage, enhanced the crosswalks, put up the signs that the road was obviously, bike-centric road. Bikes were allowed full use of the lane. We had two significant road crossings. The arterial one in that photo there, the lower left corner there, where we actually ended up putting in some, you can see some little specialty bike signs going across the middle of the intersection there. And that's still a two-way stop intersection, but we put in a push button, tactile warning flashing device there. I will say one of the things on that we obviously had to comply principally with the ADA on that, and I'm still looking for a good way to get some type of a tactile or a run over for cyclists, because it isn't quite as nice as I'd like it, because you need to ride up onto the sidewalk to hit the button in order for the light to flash. I think we'll get into it later on, some of the concerns, but really it was the committee behind it, and then getting the council behind it, and then getting the people that lived on the road not to have any fear over the concerns. Obviously, we're going to lose parking. We wanted to create a bike-centric road that came right down into the core of our downtown, and we're one block off of our town plaza, really the lifeblood of our town. This goes right past some major areas where people go to have breakfast in the morning and go shopping. We have a co-op here, so taking it one block off was a big deal towards really giving some respect to the bicycle and saying, hey, here are these bike-centric areas coming down into town. And luckily we were able to not, we didn't eliminate any parking as a result of this, and that was obviously those of you that deal with the public works issues. Parking is it's a big thing for people, and when you start eliminating it, they get really, really concerned. The project also involved some stop sign flip-flops. What I mean by that is we flipped them around to make it more conducive for the cyclists to be able to use these kinds of bicycle thoroughfare. And it was successful in one case, and in another case it wasn't successful. We in my opinion, kind of forced the matter, trying to kind of comply with what we'd seen in other instances, other designs, and ended up just kind of going back to a four-way stop from what were a flip-flop two-way stop, and it doesn't really seem to have affected the performance, but I think from an overall safety aspect, rather than just having bikes jetting through and people not being used to for 50 years, this is always where that stop sign's been. We opted to stick with the four-way stops. The public outreach, just quickly, we really kind of did it as a two-phase, because the bike boulevard meets the middle upper picture there where the bike hub is running right kind of through the core of our downtown area there. And we chose to have two public meetings on this, one really geared towards inviting all the business owners so we could hear their specific concerns. And then we had a second meeting. Everybody obviously was allowed at the meeting for the neighborhoods to kind of address their concerns. We did create an FAQ, a frequently asked question, paper that we put up on our city website, and kind of went through, how fast you're going to going, what are the construction impacts, what was the purpose, why are we even doing this? And that was obviously a question that came up with a lot of people. We got a lot of good input out of that, and what I will say on the business side is the discussion ended up to some degree being dominated by one or two business owners, and with the council, we ended up doing a minor reroute around, basically did a two-block over. We kind of stepped it out around, and that was really the council wanting to, hear and be understanding of concerns from the business owners, and it worked out, but people still use the main north-south corridor, I Street. and it didn't really make much change, but there was quite a bit of discussion. So I would say you really want to get with the business people early on that. Other than that, I look forward to some questions on this. I'm really happy with what came out of this project, and I would say the east-west route, 10th Street, has been very successful. It really, we're going to be doing some follow-up counts on there and hoping to be able to record those. It really see a lot more bike traffic coming into town that way, and it really created a safer, viable crossing rather than being on the only other road immediately adjacent to it. It's our truck route, etc. So this is nice and offline. The north-south one on I Street, we have hills like most places out in California do, and many places. So the hill still creates some type of aversion for people, but we're working on that.
Well, Dobie, thank you very much. That's an excellent overview of the project, and it's a really interesting one. There has been a lot of interest around the country from various projects that we've been involved in, and people are constantly asking for information about bike boulevards. Some areas of the country talk about neighborhood greenways, and some areas still are starting to refer to them as calm streets. And so I think there's a lot of interest because everybody wants to make it their own. And I think you touched on all of some of the main points that keep coming up when we have these conversations with people about how you go about doing that process. And both of you today here are talking about projects that were completed before the guide was finished. And so we look to you in creating the case studies for these to talk about how these things were implemented in your communities. And Dobie, I thought it was great that you mentioned kind of some of the challenges inherent in the design as well as in the public involvement process. Your mention about having the push button, but it's not in the best location, and attempting to change some stop signs around and trying to see what works, and then maybe changing it again, knowing that it doesn't need to be all perfect and all completely done at the same time, and that you tweak things and you test things as you go. So I thought that was very kind of cool. And also your mention about the fact that you're the only transit hub in that county. I think that's something that is also something that smaller towns and rural communities deal with, in noticing that they have specific needs, especially if they're talking about being a center of activity for areas that are more rural surrounding them. So I thought that this was a really good overview, and as Dobie mentioned, we're going to get into quite a lot of great questions that we're receiving from some of you around the country based on some of these presentations and some of the questions that have popped up. So we also are going to leave this screen up, but in case some of the questions actually do revert specifically to some of the facilities that are featured in the photographs, I can certainly go back so that people can be looking at this for greater detail as the question's being answered. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, we have Sydney Leonard, who's actually being able to field these questions, and she's going to be pitching them to us. And we also received a little bit of buzz prior to today's webinar presentation about a particular question. So Sydney, if you're on the line, I was curious as if you could give us that first question to get us set on our discussion portion of today.
Hi, Tim. Yes, this is Sydney. So we had a question come in before that's pretty interesting and pretty relevant probably to everyone who's on the line. For Dobie and Stephen, did you ever experience public or stakeholder comments such as there aren't enough cyclists to prioritize bike infrastructure, or we'll talk about bike infrastructure when it's been demonstrated to be a safety issue? And what techniques or strategies did you use to address these? And are there ways of presenting a plan or design to increase buy-in?
So Stephen, you mentioned that this was actually more of an opportunity than a plan. So I was wondering if maybe this is something you could talk a little bit about, kind of Sydney's question about estimating demand and responding to concerns over whether or not the project has enough demand to do so. So let's get started with Stephen, and then Dobie, feel free to chime in as well on your experience.
Sure. Yeah, we ran into those questions as well. One of the things that we benefited from on our end was the Swamp Rabbit Trail in Greenville, South Carolina. We are about 10 minutes from Greenville, South Carolina, and about 15 minutes from Clemson University, Clemson, South Carolina. And they had recently done what was called the Swamp Rabbit Trail that ran through a small town similar to Pickens, a little bit bigger than Pickens, a little smaller than Easley. And there was, over about 5 to 7 years, a massive amount of redevelopment and growth in their downtown along the trail. So we were able to point very quickly to success stories and say, look, right over here, this is what we're envisioning, something very similar. We've got people in the community that the bikers actually showed up to the public hearings to be very vocal about their desire to have this. And one of the things we also had was the information to show the amount of tourism and economic impact that it had in one of our neighboring cities, to show that there is a benefit, there is a long-term investment, a long-term benefit associated with it. That helped a lot. A lot of what we did as well was have some one-on-one meetings with people that raised some major concerns, especially in the design process and during the feasibility study. And so that helped get a lot of those questions answered, like Dobie talked about with the businesses. We would do a lot of one-on-one with people, because what we found is if you try to talk about it in a big public forum, you do have those one or two people that will try to dominate the conversation, and somebody may just have a simple question like, how's this going to impact my driveway? I just want to know how people are going to get across right here. Are y'all going to fix this drainage issue or something like that? So those one-on-one meetings for us proved to be a lot of benefit, and pointing to the success stories around us and in other places in the country also proved to be a benefit in helping to take some of those naysayers and turn them into positive people.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Dobie, just kind of curious about some of the things you may have run into when answering those questions or dealing with some of the concerns that the community put forth when implementing the Bike Boulevard in Arcata.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, ours did come up during planning process developing of the biped master plan, but the main points were that we tried to kind of orient them between destinations, the one route between the intermodal transit facility and then kind of running parallel to a road that the cyclists have been complaining about for years. They're uncomfortable. Speeds are high, trucks are on it, etc. We didn't really have the, well, nobody's going to ride on this thing, because we already have a pretty fair cycling population. We did get the cyclists, obviously, to come out. The Transportation Safety Committee was behind it, and the council supported it through the General Plan 2020. The aspect of which road it was going to go on, because there was quite a bit of discussion, you know, I Street versus J Street. We had we ended up coming up with an alternatives analysis on that, and that really came down to kind of the business, the meeting with the businesses, and it was the council that ultimately gave us the direction to go ahead and say, hey, we're trying to make a really nice bike access coming right down into the heart of town, and that's really kind of what drove it home. And I have to say, I don't think we ever really had a concern that we weren't going to get the cyclists on it, because they were already there.
That's a good point. Yeah, definitely. We've actually seen a lot of questions come in about some of the things on Stephen, your presentation, specifically related to the fact that it has some shared streets involved in the design, as you mentioned. And so quite a few questions about kind of the transitions to and from, and how do users go from one to the other. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those shared streets and what you did with signage, pavement markings, and anything else to help kind of articulate that, both to the bicyclists using the trail, as well as motorists that might see bicyclists coming to and from a trail facility, for example.
Sure. When we did the 1.1 mile extension, about the first half of it was still in the old trail, the old railroad bed that we had purchased. That was an easy section. One of the things that we did is we had a road that ran right parallel to the railroad, and you can actually see that in, I was looking to see if it was in one of the pictures. Well, you can see it in the top picture next to the grand opening. That road that runs parallel to the trail there actually kind of follows the trail all the way into downtown. And what we found is that road was underbuilt. It was narrow. It needed some work to be done to it. So we took it as an opportunity to bring the trail in, and we have it flows right into the correct side of the road. We have the trail on, if you're riding into downtown, on the right side of the road. So when you come off of the dedicated trail onto the road, it flows directly on it. the design part of it was kind of interesting. We had a good architect on that, Blake Sanders with Alta, and he helped us design that and brought it in to several different options. And this is where the community input came in important, because we had looked at doing the signal, the separation and the design one way, and when we went out into the community and sat down with them, they said, look, we don't like that. We feel it's going to make our road ugly. It's going to do some things that we don't feel comfortable with. So we actually sat down with them and went through about 3 or 4 alternate designs to make sure we had one that they felt comfortable with, that still made it safe for our people who are using the trail, still made it visible to the roads that we're going to be driving on the opposite side of the road, and to also make sure that people who live there felt comfortable without it being an eyesore. We actually found when we went out on site versus designing it and started doing construction that we were able to scale back a good bit of our delineators in the road to make it not look at such an eyesore, and we were able to make them lower. And we did use a good bit of markings on the road to make sure that people knew that it had gone to one way. We put out public information. We actually delivered letters to every person who lived along the road. You know, we used Facebook, Twitter, newspaper, everything that we could to push the information out. We put signs up for new traffic patterns and all that good stuff that you do whenever you're changing something like that. But every time you implement, there's always a little hiccups that come up. One of the hiccups we had is, if you look at the bottom picture, we have a city-owned cemetery that we actually bring the trail through that has a road running through it. And that was a 2-lane road before. So one of the things we had to address is people who are parking to visit the cemetery out there, because there is no parking in the cemetery, so they park along the trail. And we had to actually change some of the colors on the delineators and put some signage and put some information out to let people know, you know, where to park. And we left the delineators far enough apart so that people could actually pass people who are parking on the trail or parking on the road, to make sure that people could still visit and put flowers out at the cemetery. At the same time, we had to put signage on the trail side for people riding to make sure they were looking out for the cars that were passing the parked cars in the cemetery. So it was kind of dealing with some of those issues as they came up, that we actually set what it looked like by talking with the community and talking to the people who were actually using the road and the trail to find out the best way to sign it, to delineate it, and to make sure it was something that would be used by both motor vehicles and bikes. And I think what we ended up with was a good success. So far, we haven't heard any complaints after it's been implemented, and we addressed everybody's concern.
That's great, and that's actually really interesting, Stephen. And thanks for kind of elaborating on that, kind of talking about that there was a little bit of back and forth with the community regarding some of those concerns. So that's really helpful to kind of understand. We got a lot of questions kind of referring to some of those design specifics, and I think that's usually where people are very curious, and so thanks for elaborating on that. Adobe, let's turn to you. We actually fielded quite a few questions so far, particularly related to some of the pavement markings that are in the photographs featured on your slide. A lot of interest in many of the things that are featured here, particularly those that are expressing concern of placing bicyclists in the middle of the roadway, and does this help keep them out of the door zone? So that's what's kind of note when you look at the pavement markings that are at the top. There were quite a few people that were very interested in the intersection of these two facilities and the pavement marking there and the intersection in that upper right photo, that wheel image that's imposed upon the pavement. Lots of interest in that. And then on the bottom, there's 2 images showing that intersection where the bicycle facility symbol continues all the way through the intersection in both directions. And in the interest that everyone has been sharing in their questions, many of the questions are centering around how much of these are MUTCD, how much of these are your city's interpretation and modification of that, how many of them are artistic features. This is a great point of discussion, because some people are interested in how much deviation you had from adhering to a strict standard, for example, and being able to use the guide that gives you some flexibility in which treatments you use and where. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the pavement marking discussion as the implementation process was ticking along.
Yeah, well, I call it the mushroom head biker. That's straight out of the California Guide, and the Bike Boulevard is an adopted symbol in California. And I've got to say, I believe it's an MUTCD standard. This was derived funding through Caltrans, so we did have a lot of our own ideas on this, and they kicked back during one of the final reviews at headquarters that they wanted everything to be in compliance. So yes, this is a MUTCD, or at least a California MUTCD compliant project. We ended up doing some striping, some arrows, and directing people up onto a little shared way that they ended up coming back and kind of saying, no, we're not gonna pay for that, and we chose to keep it in. The signage is pretty straightforward. We came up with our own little design. One of my techs, worked out a little design. We're a little hemisphere type city. We have a lot of signs that kind of have that hemisphere shape, and we wanted to kind of show kids and parents and carrots flying off of there. So that's where the signage design came from. I call it the prancing bikes across the intersection there. And I just really felt that that in addition to, and you don't see it in that lower left picture there, we had not yet installed the electronic signage was behind in the installation when we shot this video of the project locations. But I really wanted something that kind of highlighted, hey, this is where the bike rides, and that's why I chose specifically to put it right out in the center of the lane. And under the policy that we had adopted, the bike is allowed full use of the lane, and that is a very specific portion of this. We're using that comes from the Sharrow concept. Those of you that are familiar with the Sharrow concept, that a bike is allowed full use of the lane where they can't meet the minimum separation, or we couldn't do some other type of bike lane, etc. And for the most part, I've got to say it's been very successful. We get a lot of trailer traffic, I call it there. Kids in trailers and people that haul their stuff around in trailers. And the vehicles fully use the lane to pass them, or kind of now anticipate that they're going to be pulling up behind them and just kind of slow it down. Hey, if I'm on this road, I may come across a bike, and I haven't had any reports of aggressive driver behavior, etc. And then back to the crossroads there. We used to be the city of roundabouts. We've designed a lot of roundabouts, a lot of traffic calming circles in the last 20 years or so. This one, I really wanted something that kind of looked like a bike, centric there. And we still have the plan that we're going to paint that someday. We actually had the concrete screeded in a spoke. We took a true bike spoke, and there's crossover lacing on that, if you could see the wheel there closely. So that's maybe we'll get to it in this year's budget. But I will tell you the one thing, the most controversial probably part of this project was in the very center of that, we left a protruding hub of about a 2-foot diameter. It was kind of like a little mini mountable traffic circle nub, and I took a lot of heat, and I'm just going to tell you my words. Do not be afraid to try something. That's our mantra here. And you can always, don't be afraid to change your mind and go back. I think you mentioned that earlier as well, Tim. I hate to use the word experiment because it's not really an experiment. It's based upon sound judgment, in my opinion. But we wanted to try something here, and you have to kind of fit it. You got to tailor it to the needs of your city, your community, etc. And that nub, we left it protruding there, and boy, we got hate mail and what the heck's this? Made the news, and we ended up grinding it out, and now it's flat. And but that was probably the most controversial part of that. But it also is it's something everybody recognizes now when they come across there that this is indeed kind of the crossroads of our two bike boulevards.
Thank you, Dobie, very much. I appreciate it. And yeah, I definitely I like that description about not being afraid. And I think when some people are implementing something for the first time or they're about to go about the plan, many people have expressed concern about how much can you deviate in your design and how rigid is the MUTCD for people who don't use it every day. And you definitely hit on all the points on the kinds of questions that we field when we're working across the country on various projects. People expressing concern on how to interpret that guidance. And you made mention, which you're absolutely right, in that California continues to evolve and innovate with beyond that. And each state has their own interpretation on various ways to allow bicyclists the full use of the lane. I know that in Michigan they have their own interpretations on how to provide that guidance. So I think you touched on all of the kinds of questions that we've been seeing here in the chat box about the different types of treatments. And I think that you're absolutely right in saying, while it's not necessarily, you don't want to call it an experiment, it's actually a very methodical process when doing these types of projects. And even the MUTCD has its request to experiment feature for that very reason, encouraging people to push the boundaries of design. So I thought that was an excellent way to summarize kind of the questions that we were seeing. And it looks like we've got time for one more question, and of course this may come as no surprise to either of you, is questions about cost. Both Stephen and Dobie, you mentioned having been able to do these projects, and the questions that we're fielding here in the chat box talk about that smaller towns and rural communities also have smaller budgets and limited access to some funding. So I was wondering if both of you could speak briefly on kind of the general budget and how you went about finding money to pay for these types of things. And then Stephen, as I mentioned, I'll start with you on this one.
Okay. Ours was all funded through a hospitality. We have a hospitality tax here in South Carolina, 2% on prepared food, and it can be used for tourism and recreational facilities. We actually did a bond against that. We did one for $1.1 million. Pickens did one for $1.1 million for the total cost to purchase and construct the original 7.5-mile Doodle Trail. A lot less than we thought it was going to be. We were able to purchase the trail for about $500,000 and construct it for about $1.5 million. That being said, the next 1.1 miles in the downtown, we did another bond, and it totaled $1.5 million to bring in another mile, because we got into more urban areas and more roads, more crossings, the design and all of that. And we also ended up buying several properties that were offered to us to bring the trail through. And we also were using them for neighborhood revitalization projects as part of a larger project. For the park that we're putting in, we actually are working with the Appalachian Regional Commission, and we have a grant with them. And Pickens County, City of Pickens actually has a grant through CDBG to do the demolition remediation for the old train depot that they have. And they also have an Appalachian Regional Commission grant to help with their park. The CDBG is an 80-20 match. The Appalachian Region Commissions are dollar for dollar. So our park is going to run about $425,000. We're putting up 215, 212, 215, and the ARC grant will pay for the other half of that. So most of our trails have been constructed with bonds, and we have some greenways that we actually have some funds in South Carolina through our DOT that will pay for transportation innovation projects, and we have a grant for a greenway right now with those, but they will not do rails to trails project as far as I know. So that's a little bit about our funding on the projects.
That's great, Stephen, and thank you for that. It's interesting, too. It must be great to have access to that funding source to get you started and to float that original bond. And then also your mention about how different phases of the project can have very different costs based on the types of situations that you may encounter. That's something that speaks to kind of the question sometimes we feel about getting cost estimates for longer corridors as part of a feasibility study or phase one. So I thought that was great that you were able to kind of mention that even two phases of the very same trail can have different cost amounts. How about Dobie? How about you? How could you talk a little bit about the cost of implementing the Bike Boulevard in Arcata?
Yeah, well, it originally came from what was, I think I mentioned before, the bicycle transportation account, and we got part of our funding from that. The project in total was, I think it was 1.2 or 1.3 miles between the two corridors, and it came in at about $240,000 with a contingency. So it was mostly a paint job on that, and I think we had $170,000 of that was through the BTA, and then we used some local money, some of our local road money to do that. And then in the scheduling of it, I was able to work this with our annual paving. We do annual paving, and we have a slurry seal program. So I was able to get the road slurry sealed prior to the application of the new pavement markings, and then and a lot of the money, quite frankly, went to some sidewalk improvements and ADA, because whenever we're doing a road type project, we're always looking to address the ADA issues as well. So just the pavement markings would have been the principal cost in this. And just to get it off, if your road's in good condition, and then a slurry seal, I think we came in about $220, probably $2.30 a yard on that. So it really made it like a new, fresh looking project. But all in all, it was a relatively affordable project.
Yeah, definitely sounds like it, and thank you for clarifying that. I think it's interesting that both of you kind of show projects at different ends of the cost spectrum. For those of you listening in today, we know that everyone really enjoys trails, and they're a very wonderful, high-quality facility, and that they do have a considerable cost associated with them. And then many of you who may not have all of these trail networks near you, or you're in a city that you'd like to provide a similar facility, the bike boulevards are really becoming popular, and they can be done for, as Dobie mentioned, pretty low cost, which I think is a fantastic alternative to offer to areas or across the country that may wish to do something like this. And then, Dobie, your mention about being strategic on when you do the project improvement, and that the slurry seal came first, and that you can dedicate some of the funds to accessibility improvements. I thought that was an excellent point, so that people listening in are kind of familiar with when's the time to do the project. And that's the beauty of these case studies. So I wanted to thank you both for providing kind of some of that insight in both of your projects. We've taken a few questions, and I do have a closing question that I will offer both of them. But before we do that, I actually wanted to mention to everybody listening in that there's a lot of questions that come up when learning how to use a guide of this nature. And this is a continuation of the offerings we have here at Alta Planning and Design to offer technical trainings to help people who are new to the guide or who are interested in using it learn about what's inside the guide. And just yesterday, I was in the Middlebury, Indiana, on behalf of the Michiana Area Council of Governments, giving a technical trainings on this very guide with a colleague of mine here in our Chicago office. And it's a great opportunity. It was paid for by the Council of Governments to provide this to those who are attending their Livable Communities workshop this year. And for those who stayed in the afternoon session, had a chance to go through about a 3-hour exercise and lecture series where we walked through the various pages of the guide and the various treatments and how to apply them. And then we had a couple of fun exercises, a network planning exercise, and then a roadway design exercise where people worked in small groups, where you get to actually go through the guide and work through this. So if anybody listening today has an interest in that, you can find out more information on our website at altaplanning.com, and visiting through the Federal Highway Administration, learn a little bit more about the guide for yourself. And then, like I mentioned, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I want to close with a question for each of you. So Dobie and Stephen, I'd like to thank you again for joining us. And then the question that I have is, if you wanted to give advice to someone who is interested in doing a project similar to yours, what advice would you give them? Stephen, I'll start with you.
Okay. There's kind of two things that I would give, that I'd say as advice to people looking to start. One is, when you start planning, don't be afraid to think big and long term. One of the things that we did is, when we were constructing this project, Pickens and Easley we were so focused on the project, getting it completed, that as soon as it opened, the first question people had is, okay, what's next? And we were like, well, we don't really know. We were so focused on this. So I wouldn't be afraid to say, we have these big plans. this is the first step in, and after we get here, here's where we can go. And that was one of the things we've run into and that we've worked to overcome. The other, I would say, is when it comes to your community meetings, to get the input, the one-on-one meetings that we had with our property owners were so beneficial, especially when we had the design group and the contractor standing on site on their property, actually meeting with them individually means so much to them, and it meant so much in getting just little tweaks that we needed to do. It may be moving aside, flaring out a parking entrance, or it may be putting some riprap in a ditch that's going to help with drainage that they're worried about. So just sitting there one-on-one and having the contractor meet with them personally was so beneficial. And I would say if you look to do anything like that, I would make sure that your design group and that your contractor that you decide to get, that you either put that in your RFP or you make that part of your meetings with them, is that they're willing to do that, because that took so much of the concern and issues we had and addressed them.
Excellent, Stephen. Thank you very much. And that have no fear attitude, I think, continues on to what Dobie mentioned. You also mentioned that. So, Dobie, do you have any advice that you'd like to pass along for people interested?
Well, I'll just second on what Stephen said. And when we were designing, kind of going through our designs, we took them out to the business owners and people that had questions, and we did the exact same thing. I'd go out there and meet with the business owner and say, yeah, well, we'll put in some bike parking in here everywhere we had like red curb or an opportunity. I said, I'll put some bike parking in here, or looking at drainage aspects, all those kinds of things. Turning the pavement black again. I think really, keeping the community informed. This was one of the first projects, and I think we actually still have it up on our website under our engineering projects. Is we really went electronic, and we started putting up revisions and questions and stuff. So for that population that goes to the internet to look for information. So, and also as a cost-saving measure for us, because we have we got 20 projects going on right now, and being able to always refer somebody or a staff member that can take that phone call and say, hey, what are you doing on this, and at least having a place for them to go and look at something was a real bonus for us. And then we did end up doing some. One of my engineering technicians ended up learning a program called SketchUp, I think it was, and we did some of the renderings using this, so that we really had that. Here's what it's going to look like, people, because looking at an engineered plan, people can look at an engineered plan, and I can see it in 3D, but some people can't. And it was really good to have key intersections, key components, and good typicals that people could go, okay, this is going to be pretty, and maybe business is going to be better.
Excellent point. Yeah, I definitely think continuing that conversation, Dobie, is helpful, and giving them the ability to visualize, you're absolutely right, is extremely helpful. I think that's a wonderful way of kind of closing this on here. And I wanted to thank you both for your time, for joining us today. And the conversation continues on at altaplanning.com. For those of you who are joining in, the conversation continues to evolve in best practices with planning and design, as well as the implementation and community engagement that both Stephen and Dobie referred to. In just a few days or so, we'll actually be posting a white paper about the use of the advisory shoulder and the terminology of how the advisory bike lane has kind of changed over time to become the advisory shoulder. So look for that at Alta Planning's website under the Resources tab here soon as well. And on behalf of Alta Planning and Design, Stephen and Dobie, thank you very much for joining us today. I very much appreciate the expertise and the insight that you've provided on your projects. You both are at the cutting edge of design, and I definitely appreciate you helping to share your experiences with everyone who's tuned in.
My pleasure.
Our pleasure.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. This has been a great discussion, and I appreciate everyone's attention today. Have a good rest of your day, and bye-bye.